Hello everyone, I am Matthew Janda for Card Runners, and I'm here with a quickie series on moving up the limits, and today we're going to be going over No Limit 25. Goals of this series. Main goals. Provide a detailed explanation of what is needed to move up in the limits in today's games. I need everyone's help for this. I would like this to be somewhat of a group project with me leading it. Please give me your feedback and thoughts in the forums. I have not played No Limit 25 to No Limit 100 in years. If you've had a different experience than me, please feel free to share it. So I think it's always a little bit risky when you start talking about what you need to do to beat a certain limit. Firstly, I play differently than you, so things that work for me might not work for you, and things that work for you might not work for me. For example, I know my bluffs at No Limit 200, my 5-bet bluffs pre-flop were really effective, but that might work for me with my statistics, it might not work for you. So it's very dangerous to say how a certain limit plays because we might have different experiences. In addition to that, even though the limits probably don't play very differently now than they did a few years ago, especially at the really low limits, games have slowly changed over time, so my experience at No Limit 25 or No Limit 50 might have been different than yours, and there's not a lot of players right now that are playing, let's say No Limit 400, that they remember how No Limit 25 plays, No Limit 50 plays, No Limit 100 plays like it were yesterday, because they probably played those limits quite a long time ago. So there aren't really any wrong answers here, and it would be great if you've had a different experience than me to go ahead and let people know in the forums, so that way we can kind of talk this out and make sure everything makes sense. The main purpose is probably to prioritize what leaks should be addressed for moving up in limits. This is what we're hoping to accomplish here. More important and easier leaks should be addressed first. That's pretty obvious. We want to fix the leaks that are the most important, that we can fix the quickest, that need the least amount of time. And some concepts must be understood before other concepts can be learned, and we must begin addressing these concepts even if they are tough. There are some things in poker that are just pretty hard, and it's stuff that most people don't know, but we want to position ourselves so we can learn that stuff as needed, that we don't find ourselves stuck or lost once we get to a certain limit. In order to benefit from this, you have to realize how much you suck at poker. I think I would have responded poorly to these videos when I was a very new player. I just like being told, ignore this for a while, or this is too hard for now. This is a good and bad trait, be careful with it. So a lot of what I'm going to be suggesting in this video is to really make sure you understand the easier and simpler concepts first, and then you build into the more complex stuff. So if you're one of those people that's playing really, really low limits right now, but you still like learning about sort of more complex stuff because you think it's fun and you enjoy thinking towards the future in case you ever play a lot higher, that's probably not going to be all that useful right here. We're really trying to get our fundamentals down first, but then as you'll see when we move on to the No Limit 200 quickie, we are going to get into much more complex stuff that's much more difficult, but we can't even approach that until we've learned the simpler stuff first. So really make sure you understand the simple stuff well before moving on. Don't just get excited and want to learn the more complex topics. Once you've kind of acknowledged how bad you are at the game, and the way that I always sort of realize it is by playing around with Flopzilla or playing around with a variance generator and realizing how little I know, then it's a lot easier to learn and build on what you do know. So just sort of keep that in mind. Beating No Limit 25. The first real money limit. If you are good at No Limit 25, you will make more than minimum wage by a reasonable margin. You now have players who have an incentive to grind in developed countries rather than get real jobs. They're simply making more money. So begins the dark descent into the world of online poker. For better or for worse, a lot of people start out playing poker because it's fun, then they start making more money than they could at a real job, and here they are grinding even though they did not set out with those intentions. People are very, very bad at No Limit 25. Very high ratio of fish to regulars, which is awesome. Regulars lack a sophisticated understanding of just about every concept. Most people are new here, they haven't been playing very long, and this limit is characterized by minimizing big mistakes. You will crush fish not making big mistakes, and regulars won't win much, if anything, from you. That is our goal for No Limit 25. We want to not make big mistakes, and if we don't make big mistakes, we'll win money. Minimizing big mistakes. Be able to identify when a big mistake occurs and make sure it doesn't happen again. Most big mistakes will be made at least once. Just like if you put your hand on a cactus, you're not going to do it again. Hopefully after you lose $25 that you didn't need to lose, you won't do it again. Acknowledge the power of variance. You will not understand it or comprehend it yet, but acknowledge it. Enter variance generator. So through the magic of editing, the variance generator is going to come up. Alright, so this is the Variance Simulator by EV++. This is a very normal standard deviations in BB per 100, not PTBB, but BB per 100. Win rate of 1.5. We're going to say 20 players play 30,000 hands. Let's see how the best and worst player runs. That's a huge difference. The person that ran the best won 20 binds. The person that ran the worst lost 30 binds. These players were playing the exact same way, and this is only out of 20 players. You are not going to really understand or comprehend variance until you've really experienced it. I don't even understand variance, especially in real life, because I've never been diagnosed with cancer or actually really run bad. But in poker, I've run pretty bad after around 1 million hands, and I still don't understand variance. So make sure you're at least a little bit familiar with the concept before you start playing poker or before you start moving up to limits where, flips are worth hundreds of dollars. So just acknowledge this even if you don't really understand or fully comprehend it, because most people don't, myself included. Classify big mistakes based on how they occurred. Spazzes. Needlessly fancy line, which probably doesn't make sense since pulling bluffs is harder than value betting. Most of the time when you're making a really fancy line at no limit 25, it probably was less effective than a straightforward line. Not always, but the majority of the time it is, and it's also going to set you up to get stacked a lot at the end of the day when you take a fancy line and then you don't know what to do on a later street because your opponent responded in a way you didn't expect. Stupid mistakes. Calling with king-jack off in the button versus middle position tags open and being lost throughout the hand. Don't get yourself in this spot to begin with. So simply playing well pre-flop, as we'll talk about in a minute, will prevent you from losing stacks that you don't need to lose. Tilt. It will happen. You need to want to not tilt more than want to give into it. Really want to not tilt. You've just seen how bad variance is. Try to be great at not tilting. That's an incredibly valuable skill to have and a very hard one to really get. Tough spots. Unable to quickly calculate the amount of value hands in the opponent's range. For example, you might stack off or lose too much with ace-10 on a ace-jack-10 board, cut off first button. There's 16 combos of queen-king there, 9 combos of ace-jack, etc. You should not be losing much money with ace-10 on an ace-jack-10 board when you're in the cutoff versus the button. Most people probably don't know that at very low limits because they haven't really realized how many combos beat you. So it's okay if you sort of lose too much to tough spots as you're learning, but try to minimize your spazzes, stupid mistakes, and tilt. And when they do happen, acknowledge it and try to make sure it happens less in the future. Tough spots, you'll still be learning, but those are a little bit more understandable. So now that we understand what our goals are, how do we go about beginning to minimize big mistakes? Well, first, you have every single pre-flop opening range memorized and a reasonable grasp of cold calling ranges. Memorizing every single opening range is super easy. You more or less just remember the worst hand you opened in each position, then open everything better. Doing this prevents you from finding yourself in silly tough spots and gives you more time to think about your other decisions while grinding. I constantly get asked hands where I don't know what I would do because someone took a kind of silly line on a previous street, so they end up having some hand which shouldn't be in their range. Just avoid that by memorizing your pre-flop opening ranges that you'll use in most situations and have a decent grasp of cold calling. Don't call with king-jack off against an under-the-gun open. It's not good, so don't do that because that's the kind of hand that's going to get you needlessly stacked. 3-bet bluff the right types of hands. In general, 3-bet bluffing hands just not good enough to call will usually be okay if they are the right types of hands. High cards like ace-x suited, king-x suited, ace-jack off work well in position, but poorly out of position. So these are the type of hands that you can 3-bet out of position as a bluff, but in general they work better in position because you can utilize top pair more effectively and get only 1 or 2 streets of value more effectively. Suited connectors and pocket pairs work best out of position since they cannot always be called and each are really good at what they do. So when I'm in position, I'm not going to usually 3-bet bluff a pocket pair because I want to call with it, or I'm going to call with a suited connector. When I'm out of position, if those hands aren't good enough to call, they make really good bluffs. So just be aware of what types of hands go into the 3-bet bluffing range based on whether you're in or out of position, and if you're not 3-bet bluffing silly hands in the wrong spots, you're probably going to get stacked a lot less. Excellent pre-flop play reduces tough spots post-flop. Most people are really, really bad at pre-flop. Saying pre-flop doesn't matter has got to be one of the silliest statements you consistently hear other players say. Very few good players say this, and even really smart and talented people will say dumb things sometimes. You do not need to play pre-flop perfectly, but you should be avoiding being put in dumb spots. So really, stress the importance of preflop. Do not get in the habit of thinking preflop doesn't matter. That became a kind of common saying for some reason, but preflop's really, really important. It sets up what happens for the rest of the hand, and it's the easiest sort of thing to learn first. Do not flat wide out of position with hands like pseudoconnectors when you're unable to play them effectively. These hands do poorly versus under the gun and middle position opens and usually require effective donking versus cutoff and button. So, when you're playing well preflop, at this limit you're probably going to be playing pretty tight, especially out of position, because it's very hard to donk bet effectively and it's not a skill you're going to have yet. Basic post-flop play when facing bets. The general rule of raise your best hands for value, call your next best hands, bluff raise your next best hands, and fold your worst hands when facing a bet is usually a great starting rule for this limit. Exception: do not apply this rule when your best hands are strong enough to slow play. For example, if middle position opens and you flatten the button, raise nothing on a 10-6-2 rainbow board without a good reason. This general rule right here is what really got me excited about poker theory. Someone didn't tell it to me in these exact words, but when I first started learning how to randomize a bluff with a hand just not good enough to call, that's when things really started making more sense to me. This is a very, very good rule if you use it carefully. It's still a rule I use a lot, even at higher limits. But especially at no limit 25, this is a good rule to go by. It should be more complicated than this, but it's a really, really good starting point. Why? Stop and think, say it out loud, or write it down. So when I said this right here, I guess this is for why should you not raise the 10-6-2 rainbow board without a good reason. We're doing a quickie, so I can't really talk about that, but you should understand that. If not, post it in the forums, and I'm sure someone will help you. Understand this is a noob rule. Note the use of the non-derogatory noob and not noob spelt with the double zeros, and acknowledge why this rule becomes more complicated. Once again, if you don't understand why this should be more complicated, then write about it in the forums, and someone will help you. Understand you can bluff a lot on the flop, about 2 bluffs for 1 value, a medium amount on the turn, 1 bluff for 1 value, and not very much on the river. So when I say how much you can bluff, it depends whether or not you're raising a c-bet or whether or not you're c-betting yourself. But in general, if you're the better, you want around 2 bluffs for 1 value bet on the flop, around 1 bluff for 1 value bet on the turn, and not very many bluffs on the river. When you're raising a bet, the ratios are going to look a little bit different than this, but it's the same general idea where you're bluffing a lot on the flop, less on the turn, and less still on the river. More precise frequencies than this are not needed. You do not need to try to hit these frequencies, just be aware of them, so if you get a good bluff target, you don't fear bluff raising. The only reason why I'm mentioning this rule right now is you should not be afraid to make a lot of bluffs on the flop. It makes sense theoretically to be bluffing a ton on the flop, so if you get a good spot for it, or if you have a good target because your opponent's going to fold a lot, don't be afraid to do it. Position is good, out of position is bad. I'm about to commit poker blasphemy. Position is very often overrated at higher limits. People suck at donk betting, so they lose more out of position than they should. And when flatting out of position from the big blind, we're supposed to lose just less than -1 big blind, so people become biased. I actually think position's overrated, which is something you'll almost never hear someone who you hopefully think is pretty good say. But I actually think people value position too highly because people are in the habit of always checking to the preflop raiser, and they don't really understand how to donk bet well. They're also probably a little bit biased because you're going to lose a lot when you flat from the big blind because you already have dead money in the pot, so you're just trying to lose less. Nevertheless, most of our micro stakes friends at Card Runners cannot donk bet well and do not have to fight very hard for position since others don't understand its value. So value position highly and try to get in position when possible. Cold calling reasonably wide in position, let's say game theoretically optimally, seems pretty meh to me for new players. Requires floating and bluff raising, which needs to be learned but do not go overboard. So I actually think if you're tighter than game theoretically optimal in position, I wouldn't have a problem with that at no limit 25, because to make the weakest hands in the cold calling range work, you have to be good at floating, you have to be good at bluff raising. There's a lot of reasons they're there for balance, and that's really just not that important at no limit 25 when you've sort of got bigger fish to fry at the moment. You're trying to learn more important concepts, like memorize your preflop ranges and all that kind of stuff. So if you want to play a little bit on the tight side in position, I think that's fine. Cold calling wide out of position is probably going to be terrible. So if you want to be a little bit too tight in position, that's fine. Out of position, be sure your ranges are tight. They probably should be pretty tight in theory, and you might even want to be tighter than that if you're going to have a very hard time playing out of position, which you most likely will. Looking towards the future. Identify contradicting thoughts. I think people fold way too much to continuation bets, but I rarely continuation bet bluff. Likely it doesn't make sense. Man, people refuse to fold to 3-bets at no limit 25, but I hate 3-betting jacks, ace queen, and ace jack versus button opens. Yes, these won't always be contradictions, but for the most part they will be. You could think ace queen or ace jack is just such a plus EV flat that that's better than 3-betting, but that's very unlikely and borderline silly. So really try to recognize when your thought process doesn't make a lot of sense so you can fix it. Do pot odds. Learn to set up basic algebraic equations. If I bet $5 into a $10 pot on the river and you go all in for $20 total, how often do I need to win for the call to be plus EV? You should be able to do basic math because it will help you solve more complex problems later. No limit 25 is not our end goal. These are more important later on. We don't want to become the Neo of no limit 25. We want to move up and challenge ourselves. So there's probably not a single great player that is just trying to crush no limit 25. My Neo comment is from the Matrix, the one. No one's trying to be the one of no limit 25 and just beat no limit 25 for 9 PTBBs. Everyone wants to move up and play higher. So we're not just trying to crush no limit 25, we're doing this as well, so this will be more useful when we move up and we're a better player. Summary of no limit 25. We want to minimize our big mistakes. Memorize easy ranges. Reduce tilt and acknowledge variance. Our opponents will make many big mistakes, so simply minimizing ours makes us very winning players. Fish make mistakes non-stop. Even regulars will make very large mistakes constantly. Poker is a lot harder than a lot of people make it out to be nowadays. Take things one step at a time, and no limit 25 is a great place to start while winning some extra fun money. Complex concepts are fine, but most of your effort should be devoted to fixing the leaks in this video. 4-bet bluffing cold preflop, check raise bluffing turns, overbetting, etc. are all useful, but not nearly as useful as getting the basics down. So I really just want to stress this. As I said, I think I would have responded poorly to this video when I was first starting out because I would have been all excited about more complex topics. That probably isn't the best idea. Get this stuff down if you want to move past no limit 25. It's much more important, I think, than most other concepts. Thanks for watching, and I'll look forward to reading your comments. So, I hope you enjoyed the video. Good luck everyone at the tables, and let me know what you think. Bye.
Want to see your hands in the quickie? Convert your hand history using the CR converter or post it in the forums. Send your link or question